Thank you. So as mentioned, my name's Cameron Dunnett. I'm at Edgehill University completing my PhD, and I'm also a member of the Centre for Human Animal Studies there as well. My title today is Men and Masculinities in the UK Vegan Activist Movement, and exploring whether that's a site for transformation. So just to give a bit of a brief outline of what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to kind of situate my study within a body of recent research exploring men, masculinities, and veganism, as well as briefly touching upon some of the specific research looking at gender within vegan activist spaces. And then I'll introduce my first research question, which is one of kind of two core research questions in my project, and touch a little bit on my methods and methodological approach within that. And then I'm going to introduce some of my initial findings from my research, which potentially highlight some of the complexities around thinking about activist vegan masculinities in the UK. I will say this is very much initial findings from interviews that I've conducted so far and isn't like a completed project. But hopefully from that, I'll make some suggestions around what this might tell us about thinking about the kind of the future of the vegan movement from this perspective. I think there's a fairly established body of work at this point to explore this connection between kind of meat and masculinity, and it's kind of established that essentially, pretty much consistently, men eat more meat than people of other genders, are less likely to be vegan, are less likely to be animal activists, and are more likely to commit illegal different forms of violence towards non-human animals, which perhaps links to some of the other studies we today, whether that's like fox hunting or whether that's within a domestic setting. And as well as that, a significant amount of empirical and sort of theoretical research has also shown that not only are these things kind of true, but actually they're also linked to masculine gender performances within our society, what Brooke and McNeil have described as a cis heteropatriarchal specious culture, which kind of informs some of these trends. So I just want to kind of introduce a couple of kind of key terms that I'll kind of refer back to that I think are kind of irrelevant. So firstly, Warren's Connell work around hegemonic masculinity is kind of a key concept to understand, and she's sort of defined it as the configuration of gender practice which embodies the currently accepted answer to the problem of the legitimacy of patriarchy. And then the ecofeminist scholar Greta Gard has attempted to kind of consider how we might kind of conceptualize currently hegemonic masculinities within global northern societies, and she states they integrate aspects of dominance, conquest, workplace achievement, economic accumulation, elite consumption patterns and behaviors, physical strength, sexual prowess, animal meat, hunting and or eating, and competitiveness. I think it's also just worth mentioning as well some recent research that's developed this idea of hybrid masculinities. So these are forms of masculinity that are largely enacted by privileged men, which maybe integrate aspects of femininities or subordinated masculinities, such as queer masculinities, but ultimately don't challenge this kind of legitimacy of patriarchy within society, so they don't kind of radically break from this kind of gender hierarchy that we see. So kind of within this context of awareness that current hegemonic masculinities are both damaging to interhuman kind of relationships and injustices, as well as kind of increasing levels of exploitation of non-human animals. Researchers such as Kadri Aavik have theorized the idea of vegan masculinity, which she sees as a way of practicing masculinity that excludes the use of non-human animals, as well as encouraging in men a sense of greater care, empathy, and sensitivity to human injustices. So the work of Aavik sort of builds on the work of other scholars within the ecological masculinities theory, and this is essentially about thinking about pathways for men to develop forms of masculinity, to move away from kind of abusive relationships with the non-human world, and develop kind of collaborative relationships with the other than human world, including non-human animals. And from Aavik's research, she kind of discovered that veganism shaped men's wider values, worldviews, and identities, as well as just their attitudes towards non-human animals. However, I think it's also important to note that research within this field has also shown that sometimes men can reframe vegan masculinities or then veganism in line with what we might describe as a more hegemonic form of masculinity. For example, a hyper-focus specifically on the connection between plant plant-based eating and building muscle without wider consideration of the kind of the ethics of veganism or the environmental principles of veganism. And of course, as we are here today, I wanted to also kind of touch on the Vegan Society's own work in this field. So they've recently produced a paper, Veganism and Masculinity, Challenging Stereotypes and Embracing Change. And from this, they found that the vast majority of men referenced animals in their journey to veganism. Nearly half also felt the environment was important in their journey, and around 40% further mentioned health, potentially showing how these kind of different narratives are interconnected in the kind of the journeys of activists, of vegan men. And I think also interestingly from this research, at least some of they did, I think, a questionnaire of around 100 vegan men, and at least some of these challenged what they described as conventional masculinity. So they saw themselves as distanced from the kind of the macho or tough guy image. But also within the study, they saw that many vegan men were kind of continuing to be afraid of ridicule, had experiences of alienation, and still were aware of the social stigma that they felt was attached to the word vegan, especially for men and among men within male spaces. And they further emphasized the importance of male role models, both in their own transition to veganism and also in kind of perhaps encouraging more men to become vegan in the future. So I also just want to quickly touch on some of the research on gender and vegan activism. For example, the work of Lisa Cameron, which has highlighted forms of sexism being entrenched within the vegan activist movement, and also evidence, at least anecdotally, of certain male leaders losing their position within the movement to perhaps boost their own image or their own kind of identity without fully embracing the kind of more the ethics of veganism, or maybe having certain self-interests over kind of the group ethic. Okay, so in the rest of this presentation, I will kind of focus on some initial findings from my own kind of research project, which are largely centered around this first research question, which is one of kind of two kind of core research project questions. So the question is, how are masculinities performed by individuals within the UK vegan activist movement? So sort of two sub-questions that I've used to help me kind of develop that idea are, how and in what ways do these performances challenge the masculine hegemony? So this kind of dominant form of masculinity that we see as problematic in these different ways. And secondly, what are the significant moments or turning points of the biographies of vegan activists that impact how they perform masculinities? So if they perform masculinities different to the norm that we might see it, how do they get to that point? You know, what are these moments? So in order to do that, I've adopted a biographical kind of approach to research. So this is qualitative research, really grounded in developing kind of in-depth kind of storytelling, you know, so getting activists to really talk about their childhoods, their experiences, how they became involved in veganism, how they became activists, their experiences within the movement, and how being involved in the movement has sort of changed their life in a wider sense. And of course, as various people today have alluded to, the word activist can be pretty broad and can really connect to anything, but specifically my study was focused on people who were actively involved in vegan, animal rights, liberation or freedom groups within the UK, whether that's sort of full-time or kind of part-time basis. Okay, so I just wanted to sort of start off the kind of my analysis with maybe speaking to some kind of current events and developments. And one thing that kind of sprung to mind was the kind of recent outbreak of a kind of racist violence that we saw across the UK in the wake of the killing of 3 young girls in Southport. And whilst, of course, the spark for this violence was very much centered on, you know, deeply entrenched racism and Islamophobia, I think it's also important to frame a lot of this violence that we saw as forms of masculine violence as well. And yeah, the way in which kind of forms of masculinity were also entrenched with these kind of violent outbreaks that we saw. And I want to share kind of one story from my research which maybe speaks to the ways in which veganism and animal activism can be a transformative in the lives of young men. So this is Tom's turning point. So he states, at 16 I was really right-wing. I liked a lot of, embarrassing to admit now, but far-right organizations and people and groups to the point where I was definitely going down that path of being radicalized with far-right ideologies with stuff I was seeing on Facebook. And then it's like you like a few things, and before you know it, your views are being daily enforced. I was very into anti-immigration, for instance. I had views that, yeah, were just so closed-minded. I was stubborn. It was just very much all about myself. And it was only through campaigning about fox hunting that my feed on social media slowly began to change, My ability to care about others, not just myself, and about how my world would be affected also changed. I grew that ability to care about animals and what happened to foxes, and it was then so much easier for me to actually think, oh shit, I actually do have an impact. That led me to having conversations, to being more open to talk to people about what it's like to be female, what it's like to be trans. And in the past, I would have thought, well, I'm male. It doesn't affect my existence or my individual life, my day-to-day. Why should I care or think about it? I guess I almost felt a responsibility that if I'm preaching so much about people shouldn't be doing to animals and how they should be living their lives in this domain, again, it was maybe hypocritical and in some ways wrong of me to black out and stay narrow-minded about other areas of how I live my life and other social issues. And yeah, I just wanted to start by highlighting this story because I think it perhaps shows how, particularly in the age of social media, the paths that different people take, especially young men, can actually be very narrow, and the paths to radicalization or different forms of thinking can actually be very fragile, and maybe shows how, for example, animal activism can intervene in the lives of young people. And further, other participants in my study, several participants challenged this masculine hegemony. For example, some felt that this kind of traditional, conventional masculinity just wasn't them. Participant 16 stated, I think that some traditional masculine archetypes never felt like me. But I think importantly, as well as that, several participants felt that through their veganism, they developed a great sense of empathy, not just for non-human animals, but for other humans within their life as well. Participant 21 states, having that empathy in animals has extended my thought then to other people. And, you know, constantly thinking like, this person is just living their life. And I think a further way in which perhaps vegan activists specifically, and this was perhaps specific for full-time people involved in the vegan activist movement, it was like a reorientation of kind of their life goals, away from maybe these masculine ideas, to quote some of Gard's ideas, of economic accumulation, of workplace achievement, maybe of elite consumption. Participant 17 stating, the remuneration isn't great in this space, and I'm aware that if I was doing something else, I could probably command a significantly higher salary. I do feel like it's a different pattern of life. It's a different set of goals and aspirations. And further, they also link this with a wider set of kind of ethical and environmental values. So that, you know, they state that I more or less said I wouldn't drive, I don't fly, so that does mean, for example, I don't take international holidays. So again, we can see it's a reorientation away from some of these kind of consumption patterns and kind of accumulation patterns that come with embracing kind of an animal activist as a kind of full-time kind of role and as part of their life. Then there was some kind of stories or some discourses that emerged from my study that maybe align with closer to this idea of hybrid masculinity. So not fully challenging this kind of conventional masculinity, but moving away from it in certain ways. One example was maybe just not really identifying with masculinity as an identity marker, and then maybe that leads to the lack of critical for reflection. For example, participant 21 stating, my personal definition of masculinity is actually just being a decent person, whether you're a man or a woman. And some of these discourses just didn't kind of maybe fully reflect on the power imbalances that do exist within our society. And I think further, a couple of these further stories kind of maybe reinforce, again, like a hybrid form of masculinity. So participant 12 stated, I go to the gym, I'm very like blokey in some ways, I have banter, not sexist banter, but you know, banter, and you know, like, I present as very much like a man, very mannish. However, I'm very into grooming myself, and I moisturize, and I do yoga and meditation. So again, we can maybe see elements of challenge there. And participant 9, in a kind of similar way, reflects on their kind of Indian kind of heritage and how that kind of maybe challenges a Western perspective of masculinity. So the Indian spiritual tradition is very much a different version of masculinity and strength. It's all about your mind and doing what's right, standing for what's right and not being fazed by what's around you. You know, going against the crowd if you need to, being a real man or a real male figure. It's about fame, isn't about fame or money or self-advertisement. It's actually the complete opposite of that, of forsaking all of that and giving up something bigger. So I think I would argue in some of these narratives, they're maybe still framing themselves within a kind of masculine hegemony, but maybe moving away from certain ways, but not, there's still an individualistic narrative to these stories. And further, sort of another kind of narrative, a discourse that I wanted to kind of highlight, which I think again speaks to some of the presentations today, is this idea of masculinity as a barrier to veganism. Now, some of the vegan activist men did feel that masculinity and the conception around veganism did create sort of, you know, barriers between them and other men in their life. Participant 22 states, I think, you know, when discussing, bringing up veganism in front of his mates from a small northern working class town, he states, I think bringing that up as a vegan to them, I think they just find it quite comical, actually, and links that to his working class background, and that veganism is still seen as kind of unmanly. And again, participant 15 reflects on how actually a friend, or someone used to be a friend, actually became an ex-friend, exactly because of their clash of values around veganism. And he states about his friend, because of how he links traits such as empathy and compassion, and being sympathetic towards others, whether that's humans or animals, as it's been a weakness, and a bad thing, and something that doesn't connect with being a man, and how ultimately that led to their friendship breaking down. And finally, I want to kind of reflect on a couple of narratives or discourses that emerged from my research, which maybe reinforce the masculine hegemony in certain ways. So, for example, participant 23 states, I like to be able to refer to, I was going to say more manly men, but more henchmen, men that get more muscular figures and that sort of thing. So feeling that having that particular image of a man within vegan activist spaces was important. And secondly, this narrative of real men look after the weak and the vulnerable. And this was also further reinforced by a second participant who again connected this to his fatherhood. So he states, because I'm a father of two, I have the experience of being a parent, so maybe that has an influence on my mentality. Strong men defend the weak and vulnerable, and then you get immature men who are just about being dominant, and alpha males who try and dominate and make others submissive. And I think I would sort of argue from that we see this narrative in society, this idea of protecting the weak and vulnerable, which often within society are framed as women and children, against the kind of the sexual or physical violence of kind of bad men that exist within our society as a way of essentially controlling women and children, and ultimately reinforcing the subordination of women, whether that's within the home or within society. And therefore, I think I'd argue that maybe abstracting some of these arguments to talk about kind of non-human animals risks potentially reinforcing some of these kind of gender dynamics that kind of create these inequalities. So finally, just to kind of conclude and wrap up, I think overall from my research, we can see that many of the activist men did show signs of masculine transformation in line with this kind of vegan masculinity that's been theorized by Aavik. And, that even those that may be constructing more traditional, conventional, or kind of hybrid forms of masculinities, this was sort of alongside a kind of sense of compassion for non-human animals. I think important to emphasize, not only was it just that these men were a different type of person, perhaps, but there was something within being involved in veganism, being involved in the vegan movement, becoming active, that actually led to men reflecting on their masculine identity and their wider sense of who they were and how they connected with others, which I think is a really important aspect to emphasize. So just in terms of thinking about vegan futures, I think there's several takeaways, but maybe just to highlight a couple. For example, you can think about kind of the narratives that we use. So for example, narratives that frame veganism as protecting the weak and vulnerable, whilst maybe having certain influence within activist spaces, we can maybe think about how this messaging could be damaging, for example, when you think about it in terms of gender dynamics. However, I think it's also important to emphasize the fact that the masculine transformation that many of these men did kind of shows that kind of veganism can be this pathway, and vegan activism can be this pathway to anti-patriarchal forms of masculine performance, and that maybe creates opportunities for vegan organizations to work with gender organizations, to work with non-violent organizations, and frame veganism as an opportunity, as an intervention mechanism, as a tool for these organizations to use to get men to maybe think about their relations to others differently. That's it. Thank you.
Were there any questions? Yep, Matthew. Just come over to you now.
Thank you. Super interesting, and fascinating to see how this develops when you finish your thesis. And good luck. Congratulations so far. Lots of things struck me about it. One was about the kind of de-radicalization theme from the participant, because it was reminding me of the prevent training. I guess everyone has to suffer the prevent training at some level in your universities, and how animal rights is still part of that, or last time I checked it was. Which is obviously super problematic, one of many problematic aspects of it. And here you are finding evidence of the complete opposite of that, and how veganism can be a de-radicalizing, you know, influence. So I don't know, this is more of just a ramble, isn't it, than a question. But do you think there's anything that you could do with your findings to kind of push back? Because I think a lot of us are thinking, how can we push back against prevent for all kinds of reasons? So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really...
Oh, the statutory duty to prevent terrorism by identifying students at risk of being radicalised and kind of report them to the appropriate authorities in university.
Animal rights. Extremism is listed as one. Extremity.
Yeah, and I've completed that training both in a university setting and I've also completed it in like a college setting, you know, so for working with like younger children.
You have to do it in healthcare, and that's the problematic area I was talking about that Jeanette was trying to, because a vegan client goes to see a dietitian and then it's turned into some terrible scenario of extremism.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting. I think it was interesting, for example, yeah, I think like Edge Hill University in the wake of the Southport stabbings, you know, promoted the idea that everyone should redo their prevent training, and you know, so I thought, all right, fine, go on and do it. And yeah, again, I was reminded of the fact that yeah, animal rights organisations are listed within the list of, you know, kind of extremist organisations that we should be kind of looking out for among our students. And so I don't know how exactly I'd use this information, and obviously this was just kind of one story that kind of grabbed my attention, but I do think, yeah, there's potentially opportunities, right, to use this kind of information to show that, you know, these, you know, kind of far-right extremism and animal rights should not be put in the same sentence, and we need to think about how we can make sure that that messaging is kind of getting through to these kind of organisations, yeah.
Thank you. Fascinating as well. Good luck with the PhD, comrade. My question is, are you considering doing this in a kind of cultural setting? Because I think that would be fascinating as well. Because I know you're doing a UK setting, but maybe, do you know anyone who's doing this in a kind of more masculine culture setting? I'm asking this because when I tell people how I went vegan, I tell them I was a macho Turkish man, like I'm Turkish. The first reaction I gave to a vegan was, oh, let's go to a kebab shop, you're in the land of kebab. You know, that's such, even as a woman growing up in patriarchal Turkey, I was like, a macho man, and I'm a woman. So like that form of masculinity obviously has, is cultural.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely opportunities to kind of combine this with culture. I think part of my research, I guess, was an awareness that most of the already limited body of research there is in this field is pretty US focused. And I think the US is kind of unique in the way that there's this big meat and masculinity culture that's probably even stronger than it is here, but also they've got big, you know, huge like animal charities that have like, you know, massive levels of funding and, you know, sort of boards that are on, you know, huge six-figure salaries. So both of those dynamics are quite different to what we have in the UK. We have much more of a collection of kind of smaller kind of grassroots organisations. You know, so I think both of those things are different, and you know, one of the reasons that I'm quite explicit in my thing of saying UK is an awareness that, you know, if you opened it up globally, there would be those differences. If you started talking to people from the US, for example, you get a quite different picture. So I wanted to frame it kind of nationally to be awareness that the UK has its own unique kind of animal activist and vegan kind of community and culture, like you kind of suggest, and that you would get quite different results in different countries. And yeah, for example, somewhere in Turkey, like, there's also a lot less of an established animal or activist movement, right? So it's like, I know like Kadri's work is based in like Finland and Estonia, and because these countries are maybe less established, there's been opportunities maybe to intervene earlier on certain issues around like how we bring feminism and stuff into activist groups, which maybe in the more established countries like the UK and US become more entrenched. Some of these kind of more problematic aspects of the activist movement as well as the non-vegan movement become more entrenched over time. So there's definitely opportunities to try and intervene early in kind of growing movements to ensure that, you know, we don't reproduce some of the mistakes that have been made in the big movements that we see in the US.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Great presentation. I found it really, really interesting. But maybe I zoned out, so sorry if you mentioned this, but I saw you've got some citations about queer and trans people as well. I got the impression that your sample was mostly heterosexual, or heteronormative, should I say. But when you mention hybrid masculinities, it makes me think about that kind of, you said about taking on some queer masculinities as well. Did you find any of that in there? Because that seems to come up a lot in the very limited research that I've read, that men in the movement tend to be queer identifying rather than heterosexual or heteronormative.
Yeah, so within my sample I do have a range of sort of queer and heterosexual identities. This is obviously maybe the product of just a small sample size, but I've essentially done two kind of groups of interviews, one with activists who don't identify as men, who identify as women or other genders, and around sort of 50-60% of those were kind of queer identified, and actually only of the kind of, I think about 14 or 15 interviews I've done with men so far, maybe it just happened to be that case, but there was sort of two who identified as kind of queer, so the majority of the sample sort of heterosexual, but certainly the issue of sort of trans-related issues and how we talk about trans issues within the vegan activist movement is something that came up time and time again, and I think it's something that the movement really needs to reflect on and think about how we kind of approach that issue, because there's definitely seems to be creating a lot of conflict in a lot of organizations around the issue of trans identity, issues around misgendering and stuff like that. Seem to be creating a lot of divide and a lot of conflict, which I feel like could be avoided with better education, with kind of thinking about how we maybe work with activist organizations to kind of promote this. But yeah, certainly that issue, specifically trans identity within the movement, is something that sort of cropped up as an issue. And yeah, I think certainly it's something that maybe needs to be addressed within the movement, how we kind of tackle the conflict that's emerging from that.